Good morning, students. For today's class, we're going to discuss the reasons Amerindians migrated into the Caribbean from South America. We're also going to look at the areas settled by the main Amerindian groups at the arrival of the early Europeans. We're also going to look at the reasons the Taínos and Kalinagas primarily lived in different Caribbean islands. And at the end, we're going to look at the reasons Amerindian settlements might have maintained contact with one another. So for Caribbean history, we're looking at the indigenous peoples and the Europeans. Come along with me now. A few hundred years before the arrival of Columbus, the Amerindians left South America to live in the Caribbean. The Taínos lived first in the Venezuelan area at the north of South America, and they were the first to move between the 1st and 7th century AD, reaching Jamaica about 1000 AD. The Kalinagas arrived after the Taínos and were still arriving when Columbus came to the region. The following are possible reasons for their migration. Firstly, migration was an integral part of their culture, a practice cultivated and passed on by generations. Because remember now, we went from the Bering Straits theory, and now we're looking at why they moved from South America and up north into the Caribbean. Now let's look at the second reason. The population had outgrown the available food sources in their homeland, and it was becoming more difficult to feed everyone. So there was a need to find new lands to start new settlements. This was because, 1. After centuries of cultivation, the soil quality of their homeland might have been poor, so food production would have declined rapidly. And 2. Changes in climate conditions might have affected food supplies negatively. So you see, from long time ago, climate change happening. Now there are other reasons. We know that resources were used for creating shelter. Those might have been exhausted, so there was need to find new supplies. Another reason was that changes in climatic conditions might have adversely affected their health. So there was the need to find a more suitable climate. Another theory was that the Amerindians were a sea-faring people. They loved to travel by the sea, right? They loved to do a lot of activities by the sea with their canoes, their 40-foot and 50-foot long canoes. They were also good sailors and boat builders who used the sea for fishing, trading, finding food, as well as for recreational activities like playing, swimming, all these things. They could have accidentally discovered any one of the islands on one of their expeditions and opted to migrate there on the premise that it was ideal for the creation of settlements. The presence of favorable climatic conditions, manageable vegetation, right? Because the Caribbean islands are not as jungle-like like South America. South America has thick jungles, right? The Caribbean don't have such thick jungle vegetation. So that might have been a reason as well, right? And the absence of any evidence of dangerous animals might have also contributed to their decision to settle in the islands. So for example, if you were to go to the Orinoco Basin or to the Amazons, There are so many dangerous creatures in those forested areas, in those jungles, right? That when you compare those places to a place like Jamaica, it's a totally different vegetation and animal and biolife. So, in the islands of the Caribbean, the Great Antilles and the Lesser Antilles, it was more peaceful then, and you were in a safer place because you didn't have big animals like the jaguar and the anaconda snake. Those things wouldn't threaten you in places like Jamaica or Trinidad and so on, because they didn't exist in those environments. So those might have been some of the reasons why, over time, these groups migrated north and came into the Caribbean. Now, another reason was that the Taínos might have seen the islands as a place of refuge from the warlike Kalinagos, who were pushing northwards into their territory from areas located across the borders of modern Brazil and Bolivia. Right? So that is basically saying, listen, the Kalinagos are warden, so they might take for themselves. Right? Them can't deal with the constant war and killing and something, so they might take for themselves to find a safer ground to live. Right? Now, another reason, as discussed in connection with the one before, was that the Kalinagos were warlike. So they might have migrated in search of new targets, new preys, or in pursuit of the Taínos, right? So the Taínos would be running away from them, and the Kalinagos then following them, right? They just can't let go. So those were some reasons why the AMERINDIANS might have migrated to the Caribbean from South America. Now let's talk about the areas that they settled in. The Arawak people can be divided into three main subgroups, as I spoke to in the previous presentation: the Taínos, Lucayans, and Burkinians. They mainly occupy the islands of the Greater Antilles, that is, Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. Some also settled in the Bahamas and in Trinidad. The Kalinagos, on the other hand, they occupy the islands of the Eastern Caribbean. These islands included Antigua, Dominica, Guadeloupe, Marie-Galante, Martinique, Montserrat, Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Kitts, and St. Vincent. There seems to have been no permanent settlement in Barbados, which lies to the westward side of the other islands in the Lesser Antilles. We know that Barbados is the one Caribbean territory that's way out in the Atlantic Ocean, right? It's not washed by the Caribbean Sea any at all. It's actually geographically located in the Atlantic Ocean. The island's location may have made it difficult for the Taínos to return there after an expedition. The Kalinagos also shared Puerto Rico and Trinidad with the Taínos. So these Taínos that lived in Puerto Rico and Trinidad, they were quite the fighters, and so they were able to coexist on the same territory as the Kalinagos. Now, the Mayas occupied Central America, including British Honduras, which is presently Belize, Guatemala, Mexico, including the states of the Yucatan, Campeche, Tabasco, parts of El Salvador, and Honduras. So that area there, that outshoot of land into the Caribbean Sea, the Yucatan Peninsula. A peninsula, as you should know, is an outstretch of land where 2/3 of it is surrounded by water. Right? So the Yucatan Peninsula, that's the area that the Mayas settled in. Now let's examine some of the reasons now why the Kalinagos and the Taínos lived in different areas of the Caribbean. Taínos were the first ones to move from South America to the Caribbean. When the Kalinagos moved to the islands, they raided the Taíno villages, killing the men and capturing the women. They sometimes set up new villages in the same locations as the ones they destroyed, thereby not allowing survivors the opportunity to rebuild. Now you know these Kalinagos are something else. They kill the men, take the women, and sometimes the children as well. And so what you found was that in many Kalinago villages, the Taino language was also spoken, because you know that women are basically the transmitters of the culture of a society. So the women teach everything. They teach the children from conception to birth to death. So that might explain why is it that in many Kalinago villages, you know, the Taino language was spoken quite prominently, because it was the women, Taino women, that the Kalinagos had captured and brought to their villages. Alright? Now another reason. The war techniques of the Kalinagos were more effective than the Tainos, and so the Tainos were forced to escape their attackers. In fleeing from their attackers, which would have been the Kalinagos, the Tainos moved up the chain of islands belonging to the Lesser Antilles. They eventually arrived and established settlements in the Greater Antilles. The Kalinagos, in hot pursuit of the Tainos, had launched attacks against them in Puerto Rico by the time the Europeans came. However, their progress was halted by the presence of the explorers, and so they were unable to carry out further raids. And they needed to turn their attention now to the newcomers. So a different people to fight here now, right? They were fighting the Tainos. Now the Europeans come and want to eat them food. They have to go defend themselves, right? So, as a result, the section of Puerto Rico from which they had already dislodged the Tainos was the only part of the Greater Antilles that they were able to settle, right? So that's the one part in the Greater Antilles that we can safely say that Kalinagos occupied, that part of Puerto Rico. Now, a fourth reason, some Tainos were able to maintain in a section of Trinidad as they were able to withstand the Kalinagos' attacks. These Tainos were said to be very fierce, and more fierce than the normal Taino, right? You have to be strong and you know, firm and real warlike to defend yourself from the Kalinagos. They fought with poisoned arrows, right? So they would put poison at the tip of their arrows. So once they shoot it and it connects with your body and pierce your body, then the poison would go into your system, right? And they have been assisted by relatives from the mainland. So for this mainland, we're talking about South America, right? So sometimes, you know, you have families, you travel, you move to a different location, and you still have family back where you came from. Sometimes these family members would come and assist in conflicts when they were having conflicts with the Kalinagos. Now let's look at the location of Taino settlements. Tainos mainly settled in areas that were hilly And these areas, these hilly areas, would normally have to overlook the sea, where they could see if, any Kalinagos were approaching in their canoes and so on. So it was strategic. They also put their villages near rivers and streams and coastal plains, near flat, fertile land. Alright? So these are the areas that you would basically find Taino settlements. Hillsides overlooking the sea, near rivers and streams, on coastal plains, and near flat, fertile land. Now, what does that tell you? What does that really tell you about these people and the use of the land? Hillsides overlooking the sea, rivers and streams, coastal plains, flat, fertile land. So fertile land, one, they wanted place to plant their food, sustenance, right? Coastal plains along the sea, where they could easily fish and, find their food source by sea. And also travel. Rivers and streams, another food source and a means of transportation. And hillsides overlooking the sea, a strategic military position. Right? So you can see the enemy if the enemy coming to attack. And you can also, defend yourself. Because if the enemy have to come up the hill, you're overlooking the hill. There are many things you can do to defend yourself. The reasons why certain types of locations were settled. The Tainos wanted to have easy access to water for the following purposes. Domestic use, like bathing, cooking, drinking, right? Transportation and communication. The Tainos were able to maintain contact with relatives and friends by traveling by the river and the sea. They were a seafaring people. They used to build 40-foot, 60-foot canoes out of these tall cotton trees. Now, if anybody know what a cotton tree look like, thick trunk, right? And very tall sometimes. 50, 60-foot tree. Once they fall one of those trees, they use their tools and dig out the inside, right? And they do a lot of other things to it to make sure that it's buoyant, it can float and still carry a lot of things in it. Another reason why they lived in certain locations was for recreation. For example, swimming. Of course, if they're canoe people, seafaring people, they must can swim. Right? So they love swimming. It was a pastime for them to go to the river and to the sea and to swim and enjoy themselves. Another reason was trading with other coastal and riverside settlements. Right? So they chose these places for those reasons. Now, a fifth reason, fishing. They depended on marine products to supplement their diet. So like fish, lobster, crab and all these things. Anything from the sea, they would eat. Another reason, the sixth reason, was defense. They used their canoes to transport them in their bid to escape from attackers and intruders. The seventh reason, carrying out raids on other territories in order to fish and hunt freely within the area. The eighth reason, irrigating their crops to protect them from severe drought whenever the need arose. Now, many times when you're looking at the Kalinagos and their type of agriculture and the Tainos and their type of agriculture, they use a system called Konuko, right? And it's basically a raised earth, and they plant their crops within this raised earth like a mound, a little mountain, like a small little mountain, maybe a 1 feet tall, right? And they plant their stuff in this, or they'd have it in Mount a row. Oftentimes these groups, they planted in the marshes or close to the marshes, right? Close to the marshes or close to the rivers, where they could get easy access to water, or the land itself was very moist. You know that marshland, very moist, right? Because that's like a soak away for the environment. So they'd plant in these areas because it was easy to gain access to water for the crops to grow. Now let's look at agriculture, as we're speaking about the Konoko system of farming near wetlands and flatlands as well, right? That was their practice. They often chose sites on the top of hills as a precaution against surprise attacks from the Kalinagos. They were primarily an agricultural people, so they needed fertile land for agriculture, right? They did do some hunting and gathering, fishing, but they also planted their own crops. And they were, to some extent, subsistence farmers. They planted enough to feed their families, and maybe they'd have a little bit left over to trade, to barter, right? But not extensive trade. No, the Amerindian settlements might have maintained contact with one another in order to maintain familial ties between relatives, right? So they basically, they don't left out them family. They maintain their family connections. 2, to provide mutual security against hostile groups, right? Like the Kalinagos. So that's another reason why they would have maintained contact, you know, with other groups. Thirdly, they would have maintained contact in order to share culture, social, religious, and other activities. Sometimes in the way that nations, they visit each other. This prime minister go and visit that country, pay a visit, official visit to that country, things like that. Maintaining trade and communication, it's almost as if they're creating connections of alliances, or being allies. Then they look out for each other and they communicate the trade and so on. They also created political alliances through marriages, right? So you know that different communities or groups would intermarry as a way of solving any issues they had, right? So if they're separate communities and they're having conflict, one way to resolve the conflict was to marry into each community. Once you become one family, fighting is not necessary. All right. And finally, they maintain connection in order to trade with islands which shared a common language and culture. Now, we know that the Arawak, the group of Arawak people, those Lucayans, the Barakenyos, right? These people spoke a very similar language, and that language was called the Arawak language, right? So that connected them, and language was a big connector. People who speak the same language as you, it's easy to communicate, it's easy to do anything. Language is the entrance into any culture. Once you understand the language, it opens the doors basically to a whole new world. So because they had a common language and culture, it was easier for them to keep in contact with each other and to trade and do all of these other things. So there we have it, the settlement patterns of the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. Do have a safe day.